I'd like us to turn tonight to Genesis chapter number 27. Genesis 27, and as we continue in our study in the book of Genesis, we'll note tonight the mask of deception. And as these events unfold in Genesis 27, we encounter a scene that is filled with a tremendous amount of deception and a tremendous amount of dependence upon feeling. And so we ponder this once again in relationship to the covenant, and I think much of Genesis needs to be understood in light of that. We are reminded of God's faithfulness to His covenant in spite of man's unfaithfulness. A man does not always do what they know to be right, and however, God remains faithful to that which He has promised, and we see that still in Genesis chapter number 27. We also see a plot of deception. We find preferential treatment by Isaac and Rebekah that in many ways underlie, I believe, this account and helps us to understand exactly what is going on. We live today in a society that is often described by the word pragmatic. Pragmatism is simply the idea, it's an unbiblical philosophy that teaches that the end justifies the means. In other words, if the objective is honorable, then the means to obtain that objective is irrelevant. So it doesn't matter how you get there. If the end is a good if the end is a good end, a good objective, then it really doesn't matter how you end up getting there. And in fact, what will often happen is that it will embrace and even sometimes herald ideas that are unbiblical and wrong methods. We have to understand as we go through this that God's work is to be accomplished in God's way, in God's timing, and for God's glory. That's going to be a point that we are going to draw as a conclusion from that, but I also think that we need to remember that as we work our way through this. It is clear that Jacob was going to be the one that would ultimately be the younger, whom, as was stated, that the elder will eventually serve. That was stated way back in Genesis 25. It was up to God to be sure that that took place. Mankind and Isaac and Rebekah did not need to come to a deceptive plan as they did so. The results of their plan were extremely really very difficult. And the reality of this scene here in Genesis 27 is going to end up taking effect in the sense that Jacob will have to leave home, and that will be the final time that he will see his mother. Years end up passing, and so it certainly takes a course that I think they never anticipated. Let's get right into the text this morning, or this evening rather, and notice number one, a determined pronouncement. Notice verse 1 of Genesis 27. It came to pass that when Isaac was old, and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his eldest son, and said unto him, My son. And he said unto him, Behold, here am I. And he said, Behold now, I am old, I know not the day of my death. Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver, and thy bow, and go out to the field, and take me some venison, and make me savory meat, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat, that my soul may bless thee before I die. Isaac is said, as this chapter begins, to have gotten old. Some have suggested perhaps 137 as a number in my study that I have seen, but has gotten old to the point that his eyesight has deteriorated to the degree that he really struggled to be able to see. But I find it rather intriguing because to me, I believe that Isaac was well aware that Jacob was the one who was to receive the blessing. It was stated earlier on with Rebekah in Genesis chapter number 25 and verse 23 that there were two nations in her womb and two manner of people will come out from her. And it was stated at the end of that the elder shall serve the younger. I have a hard time thinking that Rebekah kept that from Isaac and did not give him that information. Nonetheless, I suppose it is certainly possible. But it is clear from Genesis 25 that God's plan was that the older son Esau would ultimately serve the younger son Jacob, something that was virtually unheard of in that day and age. We find in the book of Romans that it was Esau that God did not choose, and Jacob was the choice through whom this covenant seed would ultimately continue. Isaac most likely knew, I believe, also that Esau had sold his birthright to Jacob. Once again, I cannot imagine that that was an event that took place without his knowledge, even if it wasn't until after the fact, which it most likely was. So it seems to me that in the spite of the fact that he knew that the older would serve the younger, in spite of the fact that he knew that Esau had actually forfeited the blessing, Isaac was still determined to give it anyway. It may very well be that Isaac perceived Jacob was not the rightful heir and actually attempted to thwart what had already been determined. But Isaac says, I am going to give Esau the blessing in spite of the reality that he has forfeited his birthright. He perceived that at the end of his life was near. However, it would actually be many more years before he would actually pass. And so he instructs Esau, as we've already read, to go on a hunt, kill some game, and make that savory meat that you know I love. And then you bring me the meal, and I'll give you the blessing. We're not told how, but the Bible does tell us that Rebekah is going to end up hearing this conversation. But meanwhile, Isaac, according to verse 5, or Esau rather, went to the field to hunt for venison and to bring it. Well, we also know that Esau certainly knew the consequences of his decision earlier. However, he still attempted to receive the blessing that he knew he had exchanged for a bowl of lentils. Well, that takes us to point number 2, and a deceptive plot. Beginning in verse number 5, the Bible says that Rebekah heard when Isaac spake to Esau his son. So as Esau departs, Rebekah, verse 6, spake unto Jacob her son, saying, Behold, I heard thy father speak unto Esau thy brother, saying, Bring me venison, and make me savory meat, that I may eat and bless thee before the Lord before my death. And so now Rebekah, knowing that this birthright belongs to Jacob, she now contrives a plot, a very deceptive plot. And she instructs Jacob to obey that which she directs him to do. She says, verse number 8, Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to that which I command thee. There's obviously an issue here, because what Rebekah was about to tell him to do was to engage in deception. There was no way that he should have listened to this kind of counsel, because there is a much greater authority to whom Jacob would ultimately answer, and that authority was God. When it comes to the matter of obeying others who are over us, we need to understand that we obey them until they reach a point where it is contradictory to what God says to do. At that point in time, as we find in the book of Acts, we ought to obey God rather than men. But Jacob likewise coveted this same blessing, and so he was very eager to go along with the plot, although he did express some concern. Not concern over whether or not this was right, but concern over whether or not he would be caught and how they would be able to pull this thing off successfully. Go now to the flock, she says in verse 9, and fetch me from thence 2 good kids of the goats. The meat would be much more tender, and I will make them savory meat for thy father, such as he loveth. It's obvious that Rebekah thought and perceived that she was going to be capable of seasoning this meat in such a way that Isaac would not be able to tell the difference. Clearly, we're engaged in very deceptive techniques. And Jacob, however, picked up on an immediate problem, and it's one that we just kind of smile on. Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, Behold, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man. and I am a smooth man. There's a lot of difference between the complexion of Jacob and the complexion of Esau. Esau is a hairy man. I am not. How, Mom, are we going to pull this off? My father, peradventure, or possibly will feel me, and I shall seem to him as a deceiver. Isn't that ironic? Did you hear that? I don't want to, there's a problem with this, Mom, because Esau's hairy and I'm not. And if he feels my skin, then he's going to think I'm a liar. That I am intentionally trying to deceive him. What are you trying to do? Boy, wouldn't you hate to deceive and be thought of as a deceiver? Wouldn't you hate to steal and be thought of as a thief? There's an easy way to not be thought of as someone who deceives. Be honest. Don't deceive. Be forthright in what you do. And guess what? People won't think of you as a deceiver. Isn't it interesting that he is more concerned about Isaac's perception of him than he is about God's perception? He's more worried about being caught than he is about being honest. What a tragedy. If I'm thought of as a deceiver, the end of verse 12, I will actually bring a curse upon me and not a blessing. I want the blessing, but if I'm caught in this, then I'm actually going to bring a curse. There's a fear that is here, but it is not a fear of God. It is a fear of getting caught and facing the consequences that may come. Notice verse 13. And his mother said unto him, Upon me be thy curse, my son. Only obey my voice and go fetch me them. You know, at this point in time, the aspiration and the desire for this has become so great. Look at the cost she is willing to pay. You know, it's going to be several thousand years later from this point in time when an innocent man is going to be hung on a cross to pay for the sins of all mankind. Do you remember what some in that crowd said? Let his blood be on us and on our children. What a thought. Somebody would become so consumed with that and so consumed with their own personal ambition that they would be willing to go to this extent. Obey my voice, she says, and go fetch me them. Let's get going. It's time to get this plan enacted. He didn't have to do it, but he did choose to. The Bible says in verse 14 that he went and fetched and brought them to his mother. And his mother made savory meat, such as his father loved. Now notice how deceptive she gets. She seasons the meat perfectly. She then takes goodly raiment of her eldest son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them upon Jacob, her younger son. Every time I read this, I almost think of David trying to wear Saul's armor. And I wonder if the sleeves stuck way beyond his hands. It seems to me, in my own mind, Esau's this big, hairy monster, and Jacob's this slight, smooth individual. And I don't know that that's an accurate description, but I can't help but wonder, did these clothes actually fit him? It just seems like it would be backwards. She put the skins of the kids of the goats upon his hands and upon the smooth of his neck. And that gives you a little bit of an idea of how hairy Esau was. You ever pet a goat? They're not exactly all that furry. I mean, you don't sit there and just think, oh, wow, this goat just feels so soft and so fluffy. That's not goat hair. If your hands, the back of your hands, and goat hair can be confused, that's a hairy dude, okay? I mean, that's almost comical when you think about it. Oh, wow, it sure does feel like Esau. My goodness, what did that man have any skin that didn't have hair on it? Did he feel that coarse and that rough? Nonetheless, this is what happens. And she gave the savory meat and the bread which she had prepared into the hand of her son Jacob. Look at all of the deception that has gone into this. To say that it's a deceptive plot is almost an understatement. But that leads us to number 3, a deceptive conversation. Verse 18. He, Jacob, came unto his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I. Who art thou, my son? And Jacob said unto his father, I am Esau, thy firstborn. I have done according as thou badest me, or commanded me. Arise, I pray thee, sit and eat of my venison, that thy soul may bless me. There are a lot of problems with this. He comes in and he identifies himself as Esau, the firstborn. He claims that he has obeyed the instruction that Isaac had given him. But the real motivation behind all of it, Dad, I want that blessing. And I will go to whatever extent necessary for me to get what I want. And Isaac said unto his son, How is it that thou hast found it so quickly, my son? And he said, Because the Lord thy God brought it to me. You'd like to think he had to swallow at some point in time before he said that, but when you read it, it almost sounds like that was right there for him. This suggests an individual who is quite accustomed to deceiving. How did you manage to get this so quickly? And we actually brought God into it. You know, I've heard throughout my ministry God blamed for many things that I don't believe God was the author of in the least bit. I've heard God's will being defined as some awfully mysterious things that I personally question. There are other times where I can directly point to a fact and say, I know that is not a scriptural basis, but yet we're praying about it. Well, stop praying about it and start obeying. And here we say, and we throw God into this mix, and as though now that we've used God's name, everything's okay. Churches do this today all the time. We just want to glorify God. We just want to worship God. And God may not be glorified. And God may not find that worship acceptable if it is not done from a heart that is pure. But yet we want to say and throw this in there. And it sounds so pious. And so many people just, oh, wow, who am I? We need to be very careful that we are not suggesting that God condones or in some way blesses behavior that he actually condemns. Don't throw God into these things. Isaac said unto Jacob, Come near, I pray thee, that I may feel thee, my son, whether thou be my very son Esau or not. You kind of get a suspicion that he's on to something doesn't seem right. I've come to see my dad, and to this point in time, as I've walked into his house, he's never said, Hey, come here, let me touch your arm and just be sure that you're Dan, not Jim. Okay? Not planning on going over there tonight either. Things might get weird. But anyway, you look at it, it's very puzzling as to how all of this is going on. And it's almost a sense in which he picks up that things are not adding up. I mean, we see a little bit as to why that's the case. The voice is one of the reasons. So Jacob went near unto him, to Isaac his father, and he felt him. And he made this observation. The voice is Jacob's voice, but their hands are the hands of Esau the goat. Okay. I'm pretty sure that's in the Hebrew. Man, it sounds like Jacob, but it feels like Esau. We're going to talk a little bit about feeling and how he discerns things. He doesn't do so well. Verse 23. He discerned him not because his hands were hairy. That was the final basis. Well, he sounds like Jacob, but it's got to be Esau because his hands are hairy. Hairy hands form the basis of this man's decision. There are a lot of problems with that. I want to challenge you when you make decisions. We've had a great Bible Institute series on the importance of sound decisions. This is not a sound decision. This is an example that I considered of using one that points to this reality. This is basing things strictly on feeling, and he's going to go everything on his senses, what he hears, what he feels, what he tastes, and all of that, and then he's ultimately going to end up blessing him. And he discerned him not, because his hands were hairy as his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. And he said, Art thou my very son Esau? And he said, I am. He said, Bring it near to me, and I will eat of my son's venison, that my soul may bless thee. And he brought it near to him, and he did eat. And he brought him wine and drink, and he drank. And his father Isaac said to him, Come near now, and kiss me, my son. And he came near and kissed him. And he smelled the smell of his raiment, and blessed him, and said, See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Lord hath blessed. So here he brings this meal to him, and he goes and he begins eating, and he drinks the wine, which would be equivalent basically to fermented juice at this point. And then he asks that he kiss him. And Jacob came near and kissed him. I couldn't help, as I studied through this, my mind continuously going to Judas Iscariot. Here is an act of affection, and he kisses. But there's a whole deceptive plot that is going behind this. And as he got near enough to him to be able to kiss him, and perhaps I would even say most likely that's why Isaac requested it, he smelled the smell of his raiment. And he said, This must be Isaac, or this must be Esau rather. It's interesting to me, Rebekah knew Isaac well enough that she knew what he would look for. She had all of the bases covered. There were things that Jacob thought of. Hey, Mom, you forget about old smooth boy over here. Esau's hairy. And it's almost like, don't worry about that. I've got that covered. And I've also got you wearing his clothes so that in case you get close enough to smell him, he'll smell that. We've got the meat seasoned perfectly. The only thing that could possibly give it away would be the voice. Okay? And I wonder, did he change voice after Isaac said, That sounds like Jacob? No, Dad, this is Esau. I don't know whether he did or not. Clear his throat and, come up with some sort of excuse. We have no idea. So that continues then, therefore, God give thee of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine. All three of those terms are terms that are used to suggest a great physical blessing that would be able to take place. Let people serve thee and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. It's very interesting when you see this blessing. He stated that he asked that God would bless him abundantly, according to verse 28. According to the first part of verse 29, individuals and nations would one day bow down to him. He explained in verse 29 that he would be a ruler over his brother, that his mother's sons would bow down to him. He then pronounces a curse upon all who would curse him and a blessing upon all who would bless him. What did he do? Basically, he reiterated the Abrahamic covenant, and that constantly goes all throughout the book of Genesis. This covenant, according to the book of Romans, was going to be fulfilled through Jacob. However, this was not God's intent to do it via a deceptive way. Genesis 27, verse number 30, we pick up a decision's consequences. And it came to pass, as soon as Isaac had made an end of blessing Jacob, and Jacob was yet scarce gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. If the doors were on hinges, it would have been swinging out one way for Jacob, and in the other for Esau. They were that close together. I wonder, did they pass? I don't know. Esau, had made savory meat and brought it unto his father, and said unto his father, Let my father arise and eat of his son's venison, that thy soul may bless me. And Isaac his father said unto him, Who art thou? And he said, I am thy firstborn, thy son, thy firstborn Esau. And Isaac trembled very exceedingly and said, Who? Where is he that hath taken venison and brought it to me? And I have eaten of all before thou camest, and have blessed him. Yea, and he shall be blessed. I have blessed someone, Esau, and it's not you. And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with a great and exceeding bitter cry, and said unto his father, Bless me, even me also, O my father. Hebrews phrases this in chapter 12, verse number 14 through 17, although I'm just going to pick it up for sake of time in verse 16. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. For ye know how that afterward, when he would have inherited the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears. The decision that was rendered by Esau when he sold his birthright was now irreversible. And Isaac explains that thy brother Jacob had came with subtlety and hath taken away thy blessing. And he, Esau, said, Is not he rightly named Jacob, supplanter, or heel catcher? For he has supplanted me, he has deceived me these 2 times. Now that's not quite accurate. He took away my birthright. Did Jacob take away his birthright? No. Esau sold it to him. Funny how the facts get a little blurry as the years progress. And behold, now he hath taken away my blessing. That's true. And he said, Hast thou not reserved a blessing for me? Is there not something that is left? And Isaac answered and said unto Esau, Behold, I have made him thy Lord, and all his brethren have I given to him for servants. With corn and wine have I sustained him. What shall I do now unto thee, my son? There's really nothing left, Esau. And Esau said unto his father, Hast thou but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And Isaac his father answered and said unto him, Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. It is still not going to be nearly as plentiful as that which was given to Jacob. And by thy sword shalt thou live, and shalt serve thy brother. In other words, there's going to be a sense in which you are going to be forced to live by means of defending yourself, and you will serve your brother. But eventually, you will break off that yoke, and you will become essentially independent of Israel. Of course, Esau becomes the father of the Edomites, and they become a little bit later on. It's interesting. At this point in time, the reality of Esau's decisions sunk in. It wasn't until this point in time when that happened. You remember when he first sold his birthright, he ate his bowl of soup and just went on? Now all of a sudden that decision came back, and he realizes the consequences of it. Well, that leads us to point number 5, the final point, a difficult situation. Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. My dad's about to die, and when those days of mourning are done, I'm going to kill him. And these words of Esau, her elder son, were told to Rebekah, and she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, Behold, thy brother Esau is touching thee, doth comfort himself, purposing to kill thee. Esau is making himself feel better by the thought of killing you. Now, therefore, my son, obey my voice. I did that before. Okay. There's a problem here. Obey my voice and arise. Flee thou to Laban, my brother, to Haran. You remember him way back in Genesis 24? He was the one that came out and met the servant from Abraham. Tarry with him a few days until thy brother's fury turn away. Just for a short time, just get out of here, save your life, until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. Then I will send and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be deprived also of you both in one day? The problem is, she is going to end up passing before they ever see each other again. Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. These would be most likely the ones that Esau married. In fact, if you take a look, the end of Genesis chapter 26, they were Hittites. Heth was the progenitor of the Hittites. And so it would seem to me that Esau's wives began to give Rebekah a little bit of trouble over this birthright deal. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these, which are the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do to me? If I end up in this same situation, it's not going to be any good. Now, obviously, all of this could have been avoided. Let me give you 5 or 4 things very quickly, and we'll be done. How do we apply this? Number 1, I mentioned this earlier. God's work must be done in God's way and in God's timing for God's glory. You cannot resort to deception and think God's blessing is in that. Number 2, though perhaps initially successful, deceptive plans always end tragically. Oh, we pulled it off. No, he didn't. Achan thought he pulled it off. Ananias and Sapphira thought they pulled it off. Jacob thought he pulled it off. They always end tragically. Terrible consequences follow. Number 3, favoritism ends in disaster. I think you see that all throughout this with Isaac and Rebekah. You see Isaac with Esau, Rebekah with Jacob. And there's this constant friction that's there, and it ends in absolute disaster, and that fueled much of what took place. And number 4, temporal decisions are eventually always regretted. When Esau first sold his birthright to Jacob, nothing ever indicates that he regretted the decision. But years later, the reality of his decision proved to be something that he regretted deeply. Far too many people wish they could go back and change something from a decision they had made years before. Make sound decisions now, and you don't have to worry about those consequences in the future.